Hey guys, it's time for another Real Talk with Cullen. So on November 3rd, the third Marvel Thor movie comes out, Thor Ragnorak. This is the third film showcasing Marvel's adaptation of Nordic myths and legends. While I do love a good Marvel movie, I often feel like being a mythology nerd is the hardest nerd to be because movies always do it really weird. They always do mythology super odd and pull out weird things that just shouldn't be there. I'm looking at you, Clash of the Titans. I get when you adapt a story, things have to change. Sometimes adaptations miss the whole point of a myth. You know, they miss the characters and what they're supposed to be like in favor of simplifying them, often making them reflect Christian stories and Christian dynamics that we're more familiar with, which is super ironic in the sense of Norse mythology because they were written down by Christians, so they already have been Christianized in how they were given to us. Almost all our sources on Nordic and Germanic gods and mythology comes from Christian sources that often Christianize the stories or added Christian elements. So the fact that when Hollywood takes them, they try and just make them more similar to Christianity to make it more palatable for audiences, it's already so far away from what the stories originally were. Norse mythology is made up of the beliefs of the Scandinavian peoples, people of the Viking Ages, and even the Germanic peoples and people of England sort of worship some of these deities, like the Saxons were sort of part of this religious grouping of gods. So it's a little complicated. And like all mythology, there's no like one concrete origin story and role for all these characters and all these gods. But we can sort of piece together some sort of narrative or some sort of idea of what people thought about these deities. Leading up to November, when Thor Ragnarok is released, I would like to do a monthly series on Norse mythology. So every month, I will take a video or two to sort of stop and explain a certain myth or concept or group of characters from Nordic myths and legends and help us get to know mythology as we know it from the sources that we have, not just from Thor movies. And I'll touch on those a little bit and their portrayal of characters like Thor and Loki and Odin. But I want to really spread the story of the original stories and let people get to know these characters because I find them very interesting, and there are a lot of really interesting characters that are often overlooked in more modern adaptations to simplify the cast, which I get, but sometimes they kick out the coolest characters and just keep basic ones. Just saying. Nordic mythology mainly comes to us through the writings of this Icelandic chieftain called Snorri, I believe, and he has two books called the Eddas. The Prose Edda, which is made up of prose, and the Poetic Edda, which is made up of poems. And these are our two main concrete sources on Nordic mythology. Without them, we really wouldn't know what was what. We just have a few like Roman writings on German people and the Gauls and stuff. Like we wouldn't have a ton. And these were written in the Christian era in Christian Iceland, albeit Scandinavia and Iceland were some of the last places Christianized in the Middle Ages, but they were definitely written by a Christian world and with knowledge of Christian beliefs as well as the Greco-Roman gods. And so in addition to some Christianization, there are often efforts made to sort of make them similar to the gods of classical mythology to make it more understandable and relatable to modern audiences. So in addition to these legends being coded in Christian elements, they're also coded with elements designed to relate them to the stories of the Mediterranean deities, like the legend of Hercules and Zeus and Aphrodite and that whole gang. Nordic mythology is probably the second most well-known mythology, second to Greek mythology, because in the Western world we're most familiar with the myths and legends of Europe, and those are mainly either from the Mediterranean south or the Teutonic north. While we mainly are familiar with the denizens of Olympus, people are relatively familiar with Asgard enough that like Thor and his hammer are in the cultural subconscious. Norse mythology doesn't have all the togas and dramatic love triangles and gods fighting amongst each other over certain cities and mortals. In Nordic mythology, it's much more like Lord of the Rings meets every fantasy video game ever meets like sweaty bros with sweaty beards. The Norse gods are in a battle against the forces of evil, the giants, and other monsters. So while the Greek gods just kind of party on Olympus and sort of have responsibilities, but they really are more concerned with like their love interests and the worship of people, the Norse gods have a job to do. They have to protect their status, they have to protect the world. They're immortal, not by nature, but by eating these magical apple, fruit, nuts, things. And that's what keeps them immortal and unaging. They lose things. They lose loved ones. Odin loses an eye. They lose their innocence. They lose their integrity over time. The gods are darker and more tragic. In a way, Norse mythology is like the darker, edgier cousin of Greek mythology. There's more of a sense of stakes. There's an apocalypse. The world will end. Whereas in Greek mythology, the world's just going to keep going and the gods are just going to be doing what they do, messing stuff up for everybody because of their petty drama. Yeah, so Greek mythology, giant soap opera. Norse mythology, giant mythological epic.